No one expected that a single line on a narrow military form would change the course of an entire day. They could not believe that one small clerical error would matter more than radio orders, coded briefings, or landing charts. In the first days of June 1944, the corridors of Allied headquarters hummed like the engine room of a ship, the staccato rhythm of typewriters, tangled telephone cords, the smell of damp uniforms and drying paper. Between tables moved men with the same exhausted eyes. Their attention was fixed on maps of the channel and tidal tables, but beside those maps lay modest folders belonging to the medical corps, lists of bandages, stretchers, tent markings, and procedures for receiving the wounded, including those who, just yesterday, had been enemies. On one of those folders, a trembling pencil had made a note that no one noticed at first. The unit code responsible for processing prisoners of war had accidentally shifted into the column marked for beach priority unloading. Supply clerks were used to abbreviations Medevac, LST, POWMED. In the rush of final preparations, such symbols floated through the air like buoys in fog. On the manifest that would soon reach the ship decks and the beach masters, POWMED appeared next to beach priority. On paper, it looked like a mismatch. In reality, it became a turning point. Long before that, on the far side of the world, in the Pacific Islands, medics had learned to work fast and silently. Their field reports carried halfway across the world in mail sacks described how, among coral reefs and tropical humidity, they had been forced to establish small neutral zones around white tents marked with red crosses. In those patches of heat and exhaustion, officers had noted that clearly defined medical zones for captured enemy soldiers reduced tension around the front lines. Men who had been fighting minutes earlier now moved toward those zones, not as enemies, but as survivors. And around those tents, the gunfire always faded faster. These reports seemed like footnotes to the larger war effort, but in Europe, logisticians read them carefully. Between the lines, they saw a crucial point. Well-organized aid stations for prisoners were not just humane, they were efficient. They cleared evacuation routes, prevented overcrowding, and created predictable order where chaos otherwise ruled. Thus, by June, several landing units had quietly included new instructions. Deploy portable aid posts so that even in the first chaotic hours, there would be a space to register, treat, and sort the wounded, including captured enemies. The plan called for clear markings and for assigning personnel who could handle both sides impartially. But no one expected that. Because of one misplaced code, these stations would be among the first to touch the sand. In one of the logistics teams that night worked a young quartermaster's clerk, an anonymous man trained for secondary duties, dreaming of returning to civilian accounting. He did not set invasion routes or write messages to generals. His job was to match stowage charts with manifests, crates with codes. In the noise of printers and voices, he noticed the familiar sequence beach priority beside POWMED and assumed it was meant to indicate that medical supplies were to be unloaded first. He knew one truth: the front could not function without the medics. Whether the wounded wore Allied or Axis uniforms did not matter to him. Because of that, several cargo holds were arranged so that crates marked POWMED were closer to the landing ramps. They contained folded tents with Red Cross flags, rolls of bandages, record cards for identifying prisoners, small tin bowls, extra canteens, and envelopes labeled in several languages. Water, silence, do not move. Assigned to them were a few men trained to treat the wounded impartially and to record their identities for transfer. When the ramps dropped, these men would step off together with the supplies. At dawn, when the sea still smelled of oil and salt and fog hung low, the first landing craft approached the shore. The planners had calculated every minute, but chaos ruled once boots met sand, gunfire, surf, smoke, and confusion. Amid that storm, a small fragment of order appeared. Behind the first line of sandbags, low tents rose, marked with the Red Cross. Inside, wooden platforms were laid, crates were opened, and stacks of record cards were placed on makeshift tables. At first, the medics brought in only their own wounded, but within an hour, enemy soldiers began arriving, dragged, carried, or stumbling. The tents were ready. The cards were filled in. Simple cloth tags were tied to wrists, color-coded to mark the urgency of treatment and the next transport point. The process was mechanical but efficient. Then came an unforeseen effect. The very presence of those functioning medical tents where prisoners were being treated created a corridor of restraint. Soldiers on both sides recognized the neutral meaning of the Red Cross. Around those zones, the shooting slackened. It wasn't a miracle, just structure. Tent, mat, bowl, water, bandage, record, stretcher, to the sea. Each small action defined a rhythm stronger than the chaos outside. Reports from the Pacific had hinted at this, but here it was proven. Clear order, visible and consistent, reduced violence even in the thick of battle. The marked tents became islands of predictability. They stood there because a clerk had written a code in the wrong box, and because of that, they stood early before the tide turned, before more men died. Later, supply officers would attribute it to coincidence, good weather, quick-thinking deckhands, favorable tides. Medics would note in their logs that, for once, procedures had worked as intended, that the record cards prevented overcrowding, and that having a designated area for enemy wounded avoided conflict near the stretchers. Higher officers, reviewing after-action reports, would quietly mark that casualty rates near those beaches were unexpectedly lower. Meanwhile, the sheet of paper that had caused it all lay forgotten under a paperweight, the pencil mark smudged by a thumb. No one had yet linked that clerical error to the fact that hundreds of wounded Allied and Axis alike were alive that afternoon who might otherwise have been left behind. In the following hours, the beach would change shape again and again. Some tents destroyed, others expanded, makeshift racks built for drying clothes, buckets placed as improvised wash stations. In each, the same set of actions repeated: bandage, record, transport, survive. With every completed form and sealed tag, chaos receded just a little. It was the beginning of a story in which one unintentional pencil stroke in a supply room became more powerful than any strategic plan. The lessons drawn from Pacific Islands had quietly merged with European reality in the most critical hour. No one expected such an outcome. They could not believe that order born from a mistake could hold firm against the tide of war. But it did, and the quiet work of those who unpacked the crates near the ramps saved lives no one would ever count by name. When the reports from the first beaches reached the medical command ships, they were sparse, written in the same steady tone as every other entry of the invasion. Initial landing of medical sections successful. POW treatment posts operational. Casualty sorting effective. There were no exclamation marks or underlines. Yet behind those dry lines lay something no one had planned for: the first functioning neutral zones of the invasion, where the wounded of both sides lay side by side under the same canvas. In the hours that followed, the flow of human wreckage increased. Landing craft returned to the ships, loaded not only with Allied casualties, but also with men in enemy uniforms, hands raised, eyes vacant, bandages soaked. The medical officers had expected chaos. Instead, they found rhythm. The mislabeled cargo had allowed the prisoner aid tents to be set up before the main supply train clogged the beach. By sheer accident, the infrastructure for humane order was in place before confusion could consume it. On the ships, the surgeons worked in narrow corridors of light, their gloves powdered with salt, their voices calm. The records that reached them from shore were clearer than usual. Short, legible entries identifying each man by code, noting nationality, injury, and field treatment given. Those codes corresponded to the cards packed in the POW-Med crates, the ones that were never meant to be opened first. Each detail saved seconds, and seconds on that day were a currency of life. Farther inland, where infantry pressed through hedgerows and smoke, The existence of organized prisoner aid zones produced a subtle but profound effect. Patrols bringing in surrendering groups no longer needed to argue where to place them or who should guard them. The medics had space for them. The tags identified those fit to walk, those needing evacuation, and those beyond saving. The administrative burden of war, the dull, necessary machinery that often breaks under moral weight, was, for once, ahead of schedule. Among the senior officers reviewing dispatches that evening, few paid much attention to these medical details. Their eyes were on bridgeheads, fuel, and ammunition. Yet, below those levels of command, men in white armbands were quietly shaping a new pattern of behavior. They followed their checklists with mechanical precision, washing blood from instruments, turning the wounded to prevent shock, recording each transfer. They did not know that their efficiency was born from a mistake. To them, it was just procedure, duty, and repetition. As the days passed, the beaches transformed from battlefields into massive living hospitals. The temporary Red Cross zones became permanent points on the logistics maps. Engineers reinforced them with sandbag walls and wooden frames. Medics added storage shelves and coded flags to signal the type of treatment available. Some tents specialized in fractures, others in burns, others simply in rest and hydration. The same protocols applied to every body carried inside, regardless of uniform color. Journalists who arrived later noted this strange calm among the wreckage. They described the quiet beneath the roar of the guns, the stillness of white fabric against the gray sea. In one report, a correspondent wrote that he had seen the impossible contrast of mercy under artillery fire. It became a line repeated in newspapers, stripped of the logistical story behind it. No one mentioned the misplaced code that had put those tents there early. The myth grew faster than the truth. Across the channel, administrators and medical planners studied the results. They realized that the combination of pre-labeled materials, bilingual instruction cards, and simplified prisoner intake procedures had prevented a breakdown of order. The data were undeniable. Shorter evacuation times, reduced confusion, fewer accidental shootings near the lines where captives were processed. The system had preserved not only lives, but discipline. In the Pacific, where the war still raged across jungles and reefs, officers began to hear about the European implementation of their earlier observations. There, too, isolated medics on small islands had discovered that visible, well-run neutral zones reduced combat stress and retribution. In Europe, those lessons were simply magnified by scale. The human instinct to destroy was, at least temporarily, slowed by the mechanical presence of order. Back on the Normandy coast, the men who worked inside the medical tents lived in a strange isolation. Their world was reduced to the radius of light under the canvas and the thud of stretchers arriving. They neither advanced nor retreated. Their role was to record, to treat, to hand over. Between procedures, they could hear fragments of the sea, the rumble of trucks, and the dull metallic rhythm of the front moving inland. Each sound meant survival continued somewhere beyond their sight. The prisoners brought in from the German lines were often too weak to speak. Many were stunned by the fact that they were being treated at all. The medics treated them with the same tools they used on their own: iodine, morphine, saline drips, improvised from canteens. The discipline of the system allowed no space for hatred. The tag on the wrist defined only the type of wound, not allegiance. In later archives, this period would be described as the stabilization phase, a technical term meaning the point when chaos ceases to expand. Yet for those on the ground, it felt like silence, an unnatural, heavy pause between waves of noise. The war had not ended, but inside the tents, there existed a microcosm where it seemed suspended. When the first formal inspection teams arrived, they noted the exceptional organization of the prisoner treatment areas. Supplies were correctly logged, patients categorized, and mortality rates lower than predicted. No one could explain how the structure had been established so quickly on the first day. The officers credited it to initiative under fire. The young quartermaster whose error had caused it remained in a different sector. unaware that his minor clerical adjustment had been interpreted as foresight. Weeks later, when Medical Command compiled its comprehensive report, the numbers told a quiet story. Thousands of wounded Allied and Axis had passed through those tents in the first 72 hours. A significant portion had survived who, under standard beach operations, would have been lost. The combination of early deployment, efficient tagging, and strict neutrality had produced a measurable decrease in fatalities. Behind every figure lay the same accidental logic. By treating captured enemies promptly, the medics had also reduced the pressure on their own systems. Less confusion, fewer misidentifications, fewer retaliatory incidents. The humanitarian impulse aligned perfectly with military pragmatism. What had begun as an error had become efficiency, an unplanned intersection of ethics and logistics. The reports circulated quietly through the Allied medical networks, cited without sentiment. They did not speak of miracles or mercy, only of improved procedure. But between the lines ran an unspoken recognition. Structure, even accidental, can redirect violence. As the summer advanced and the front moved deeper into France, many of those same medics were reassigned to new positions. Some would never know the full impact of what they had built on the sand. Others carried with them the method how to establish order first, how to make space for life before everything else collapsed. The war continued, as wars do, grinding forward. Yet somewhere behind every convoy and every field hospital lay that forgotten document, still filed under routine logistics, its misplaced code no longer visible under layers of ink and revisions. What remained was its consequence. Thousands of living men, saved by a mistake too small to notice. The silence between battles had preserved them, and in that silence, history had quietly shifted course. When the war began to fragment into scattered fronts and fading echoes, the records followed it: pages, crates, typed reports, carbon copies folded in field envelopes. Among them, tucked between inventories and requisitions, lay documents bearing the same faded abbreviation that had first appeared on the Normandy manifests: POW Med. No one gave the code much attention anymore. It had become part of the standard lexicon, a routine classification that appeared in every major operation. The clerical error that had given it prominence had long been absorbed into official procedure. What once was a coincidence was now doctrine. In early 1945, when Allied forces advanced across Europe, teams of medical officers traveled just behind the front lines, cataloging the effects of the new protocols. They found a pattern repeating itself with mechanical precision. Wherever the neutral medical zones were deployed first, chaos declined faster. In captured towns, barns and schools were converted into improvised aid posts for prisoners and civilians alike. The Red Cross markings became familiar symbols not only to Allied troops but to German soldiers surrendering in disarray. Reports noted that these men would often lay down their weapons sooner if they saw the medical tents standing and active. The visibility of order had become more powerful than the presence of threat. Each report that reached London or Washington repeated the same quiet conclusion: early medical organization, regardless of allegiance, shortened combat duration, and reduced secondary casualties. Commanders who once questioned the practicality of aiding captured enemies now demanded the same system for every major push. It was no longer framed as compassion. It was efficiency, an outcome verified by numbers. Across the oceans, in the Pacific, similar shifts unfolded. On islands where the jungle swallowed entire battalions, medics improvised neutral strips near shorelines, marked by bamboo poles and salvaged cloth. The lessons from Normandy had spread through medical channels faster than through command briefings. Field surgeons on the island fronts cited the European data to justify their methods. On Tarawa, on Leyte, on Okinawa, there appeared small rectangles of silence amid devastation. There, captured or wounded opponents received the same iodine, the same gauze, the same mechanical compassion. The documentation of these practices filled warehouses by the war's end. Pages described how orderliness itself had become a weapon against despair. Analysts studying casualty ratios noticed that units employing the integrated prisoner care system had fewer post-battle breakdowns among their own personnel. The medics who treated everyone without distinction tended to survive the psychological burden better than those who worked under rigid segregation. They measured the difference in calm, in resilience, in the absence of retaliatory violence. It was an outcome no strategist had predicted. By the time the fighting ceased, the humanitarian efficiency, born of a misplaced code, had embedded itself into the operating manuals of several armies. Officially, it was referred to as standard medical containment and processing for enemy combatants. Unofficially, those who had seen it work still called it simply the Red Tent System. It required no ideology, no speeches, only the quiet conviction that procedures could limit cruelty. In the post-war years, when military tribunals and reconstruction teams searched for lessons, the reports resurfaced. In the ruins of archives across Europe, clerks retyped faded manifests to preserve them on microfilm. Somewhere among them, historians found the Normandy documents with the misplaced POW Med line. They traced the notation back through a chain of revisions and signatures, but could not identify the individual who had written it. The signature column was smudged, the pencil stroke blurred by moisture. The discovery went uncelebrated. It was catalogued as an administrative irregularity, operationally beneficial. The moral weight of the findings outlasted the names attached to them. Scholars studying battlefield medicine decades later noted that the earliest consistent adherence to the modern Geneva standards had not begun in conferences or legal chambers, but in the accidental logistics of 1944. They cited the Normandy beaches as the first documented example where large-scale treatment of captured enemies occurred systematically within the first hours of invasion. The origin of that system, an unnoticed clerical error, remained a footnote, but its consequences stretched across continents. In surviving film reels and photographs, fragments of those early medical posts appear. Low tents whipped by wind, rows of stretchers, medics bent over both Allied and German uniforms, indistinguishable beneath the mud. The camera operators rarely lingered. To them, the scenes were too ordinary to be dramatic. Yet, when later analyzed, those frames revealed the quiet revolution of procedure, a shift from improvisation to predictable mercy. For the people who had lived through it, the memory carried a detached clarity. In post-war interviews, medics spoke not of heroism, but of routine. They described the comfort of structure, the way recorded numbers replaced the chaos of emotion. Some recalled how the tags tied around the wrists of the wounded felt heavier than their weapons. They did not speak of ideology. They spoke of sequence, identify, treat, record, transfer. Within that sequence, the idea of the enemy dissolved into paperwork and pulse rates. Decades later, military academies would teach the event as an example of operational adaptability. They would not mention error or luck. The narrative was reshaped into a lesson about foresight, planning, and the value of humanitarian logistics. Yet buried in the technical manuals and course notes remained a single citation, the earliest manifest listing, WWII, beach priority. It was the quiet acknowledgement that systems sometimes evolve not from brilliance, but from imperfection. In archives preserved on both sides of the ocean, correspondences between medical officers reveal the transoceanic echo of that logic. A report from a naval surgeon in the Pacific reads, "Experience confirms European observation organized aid to enemy wounded, reduces disorder, accelerates surrender, preserves discipline among troops." Another, written in France months earlier, notes simply, "Initial misplacement of supplies produced unforeseen positive outcome." Together, they documented the invisible thread connecting two theaters of war through one principle: structure before ideology. The individuals behind the paperwork disappeared into civilian life. The quartermaster clerk returned to his hometown, resumed his bookkeeping, and never learned that historians would one day trace the origin of the Red Tent system to a clerical oversight made under fluorescent lights in a supply depot. The line he had shifted was too small to matter to him, too large to erase for history. The legacy endured in policies, not memories. Future conflicts adopted the same sequence of logic-neutral markings: immediate treatment for captives, documentation before interrogation. The principle that had emerged from a mistake became a model of discipline. It proved that even within destruction, order could protect life. In later humanitarian archives, analysts studying 20th century warfare would write that the mistake of one man on the eve of D-Day had saved thousands not only through direct survival, but through the precedent it created. His error institutionalized clarity in the middle of chaos. It transformed compassion from a moral impulse into a logistical rule. There was no monument for it, no commemoration on stone. Only records, typed lines, checklists, manifests, and after-action summaries that silently outlived the men who wrote them. In the careful handwriting of field clerks, the story remained preserved, that amid the noise of invasion, one unnoticed act of misplacement opened a corridor of reason. In the end, the war's maps changed, governments fell, treaties were signed and forgotten. But the structure born from that mistake continued to appear wherever human lives met the machinery of conflict. It existed in the red crosses on medical crates, in the field protocols printed in new languages, in the global rule that the wounded must be treated without distinction. No one expected that a pencil mark could alter the boundaries of mercy. No one believed that an error could outlast a war. Yet the documents remain, quiet and undeniable, proving that even the smallest misalignment in the order of things can sometimes pull the world, however briefly, toward life.